They say monsters recognize monsters. They say the damned can smell the damned. But no one tells you what happens when a monster looks at you and sees not a curse, but a choice. The ballroom of Castle Ravencross existed in perpetual twilight. Candles burned in iron sconces along walls of obsidian stone, their flames refusing to cast light so much as devour it. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears, and the air tasted of old velvet and anticipation, the kind that precedes something irrevocable. Margot waited in the servants' corridor, her gloved hand trembling against the cold stone. The scarred side of her face pressed into shadow, as it always did. 23 years of life, and she had learned to inhabit darkness the way others inhabited rooms. It was safer there, smaller, less visible. Her stepmother's voice echoed from the ballroom, sharp, triumphant, cruel. "My beautiful daughters, they will have their choice of suitors tonight." Never once did she mention Margot. Never once did she need to. The girl they called Monster had not been invited to the ball. She had come anyway, because her father's ghost still whispered in the floorboards of this castle, and she could not abandon him to the vultures who now owned his name. Margot adjusted the borrowed mask, a simple thing of black silk and silver thread, and stepped into the light. The ballroom silenced like a held breath. She had not expected to be seen. Invisibility was her armor, her religion, her only prayer that had ever been answered. But as she descended the marble staircase, she felt the weight of eyes. Not the disgust she knew, something else, something that burned like recognition. He stood at the far end of the ballroom, and the crowd had created a perfect circle around him, a void of empty space, as though proximity to him was dangerous. The Vampire King. Everyone whispered it, though no one dared say it aloud in his presence. Nikolai Corvinus, ruler of the Northern Territories, who had not been seen in public in 17 years. He wore black that seemed to absorb light itself. His face was angular, severe, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a wound so old it had faded to silver. His eyes were the color of moonlight on ice, and he was watching her. Margot froze on the stairs. Her instinct screamed to retreat, to dissolve back into shadow. But his gaze held hers with the weight of inevitability, the way a predator pins prey, not with cruelty, but with recognition of something essential, something that cannot be undone. He rose from his chair. The orchestra faltered. Guests exchanged glances sharp with scandal. No one moved toward the Vampire King uninvited. No one approached him at all. But Margot found herself descending. Not because she chose to, but because her body had made a choice her mind had not authorized. Her stepmother's daughters parted before her like water before a stone, their faces twisted with jealousy and rage. "You should not be here," Nikolai said when he reached her. His voice was low, textured with centuries, not unkind, but ancient with exhaustion. "No," Margot agreed. "I should not." "Yet you came anyway." "My father lived in this castle. He died in it. I could not let it forget him." Something flickered across his face, a recognition so profound it seemed to split the world open. He extended his hand, scarred palm upward. The gesture was not a question. "Dance with me," he said, and it was not a request. Margot placed her hand in his. His skin was cold, but not lifeless. She felt the faint pulse of something ancient moving beneath the surface, something that had learned to mimic mortality without surrendering to it. They moved into the center of the ballroom, and the crowd retreated further. The orchestra resumed playing, a waltz in a minor key, the kind of music that sounds like mourning disguised as celebration. "You know what I am," Nikolai said as they danced. "Yes. You know what will happen if you let me close enough to love you." "Yes," Margot whispered, "and still you do not run." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a monster, but a man who had worn loneliness like a skin for so long he had forgotten it was not his own flesh. Scarred. Damned. waiting for something that could see him without flinching. "I am the girl they call Monster," Margot said softly. "I stopped running long ago." The Vampire King's hand tightened on her waist, and for the first time in 4 centuries, tears moved behind his eyes. Not falling, but present, acknowledged, real. "Then dance with me until dawn burns us both away," he whispered. "Dance with me until the world has no choice but to see us." The waltz continued, the candles burned lower, and in the shadows of Ravencross Castle, 2 broken things discovered that some monsters had been waiting their entire lives to be seen by another monster who understood that damnation was simply another word for love that refused to die. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Episode 2: The Price of Recognition. To be known is to be claimed. To be claimed is to surrender the luxury of solitude, and solitude, for the immortal, is the only mercy they have ever been granted. 3 nights had passed since the ball, and Margot could no longer pretend they were dreams. Dreams dissolved in daylight. These remained, a constant ache in her chest, a weight behind her ribs that felt like her heart had learned to beat in a minor key. She stood in the castle library, surrounded by centuries of leather-bound solitude, Nikolai's collection, books in languages she could not read, some so old the pages had become parchment, fragile as the wings of things meant to remain caged. "You should not read that one," Nikolai said from the doorway. He moved without footsteps, a privilege of the undead. "It contains the names of everyone I have loved. I burned it twice. Once, I rebuilt it." Margot did not turn from the journal she held. The handwriting inside was exquisite, centuries of script compressed into margins and fever dreams, a man documenting his own damnation. "Why did you rebuild it?" she asked. "Because forgetting them felt like murdering them twice." He entered the library fully now, and she felt the temperature of the room shift, not warmth, but the absence of cold, becoming presence. They had danced 3 times since the ball. 3 times she had let him touch her, and 3 times she had felt the architecture of her own resistance crumble like ancient stone. "You should leave," Nikolai said, not unkindly, "before this becomes irreversible." "Is it not already?" "No, you could still return to your stepmother's house. You could still marry some mortal man who will not watch you age while he remains unchanged. You could still have children and grandchildren, and the mercy of a death that comes when it is supposed to." Margot finally turned to face him. In the candlelight, his scar caught the glow and seemed to pulse like a second heartbeat. "And you?" she asked. "What do you have?" "Eternity," he said quietly, "and the knowledge that every person I have loved has turned to dust while I remain." "Then why did you ask me to dance?" Nikolai moved closer. His hand, when it touched her face, was careful, as though she were made of the same fragile parchment as his journals. His fingers traced the line of her scar, the one that ran from her temple to her jaw, the mirror image of his own. "Because," he said, "I am tired of dancing alone." Margot's breath caught. She had not known such tenderness existed in the hands of the damned. She had not understood that a monster could touch her and not diminish her, but instead illuminate something in her that her stepmother's cruelty had never managed to extinguish. "What happens if I stay?" she asked. "You will have to choose," Nikolai said, "between the slow death of mortality and the eternal death of becoming what I am. There is no middle ground. There is no compromise. Love, for us, is a binary, complete surrender or merciful distance. And if I choose you, then I will carry you into darkness, and you will curse me for it, and I will let you, because at least I will have the privilege of hearing your voice in the night. At least I will not be alone when the centuries turn." He withdrew his hand, and the loss of his touch felt like the loss of light itself. Margot understood then what her stepmother had never comprehended, that love was not the softening of edges, but the acceptance of a scar that would never heal, because healing would mean forgetting what had left it. "Take me," Margot said. "I choose darkness. I choose you. I choose this." Nikolai's eyes, moon-pale, ancient, lonely, moved across her face as though committing it to memory, as though she might dissolve like all the others. "You do not understand what you are asking," he whispered. "Then teach me." He pulled her close, and she felt the geometry of his body, hard, cold, precisely calculated to mirror her own damage. When his fangs descended, they caught the candlelight and glowed like twin moons. When they found the soft place where her neck met her shoulder, there was no pain, only a sensation like falling, like finally understanding the difference between being alive and being possessed by something alive. The blood that left her body was replaced by something else, something ancient and terrible and beautiful. She felt it move through her veins like liquid starlight, burning, transforming, claiming her from the inside out. She felt herself becoming infinite. When it ended, she lay gasping on the library floor, and Nikolai knelt beside her, his eyes heavy with a guilt that had become his second skin. "I have damned you," he said. "No," Margot whispered, her voice now carrying harmonics it had not possessed before, as though she contained multitudes. "You have freed me. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance." Episode 3. Becoming. The transformation is not agony. It is simply the body learning truths the soul has always known. We are not made of light and shadow. We are made of hunger and mercy, and they are the same thing wearing different masks. The castle no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a chrysalis. Margot moved through the halls at night, because daylight was now a thing of legend, something to be endured behind shuttered windows, and found that her vision had expanded. She could see the threads connecting every living thing, could sense the pulse of blood moving through walls, through gardens, through the servants who moved through Ravencross like ghosts. She was the ghost now. 7 nights into her transformation, and her stepmother arrived at the castle gates with questions that tasted like violence. Where was Margot? Why had she not returned? What had the Vampire King done with her? Nikolai had wanted to turn her away. Margot insisted on seeing her. The ballroom, again. History repeating itself with the precision of a curse. Her stepmother barely recognized her. The scarred side of Margot's face had healed completely. The new skin luminous, unmarred, perfect in a way that made her imperfection when it had existed feel like a mercy granted by a dying god. But it was not the healed scar that stopped her stepmother's breath. It was the eyes. They had become silver, the color of coins at the bottom of old wells, the color of things that have learned to see in absolute darkness. "What are you?" her stepmother breathed. "I am what I was always meant to be," Margot said gently. "Free." She moved toward the older woman without malice, and her stepmother retreated, but not far enough, never far enough. The hunger that had consumed Margot's entire existence for the first 7 nights rose like a tide she could no longer hold back. She could smell the fear in her stepmother's blood, could taste the decades of cruelty that had been encoded into every cell. She could take it all, drain every transgression, every unkind word, every moment of willful blindness in the face of her suffering. Instead, she stopped. She stood before her stepmother, trembling with the effort of denial, and let the hunger pass through her like weather. It hurt. It felt like refusing to scream while drowning. "I could kill you," Margot said quietly. "I could take every terrible thing you did to me and feed it back into the earth. But I choose not to. Do you understand? I choose mercy. And that choice, that is what separates monsters from demons." Her stepmother fled the castle, and Margot did not pursue her. Nikolai emerged from the shadows, his face a study in controlled devastation. You did not feed on, he said, not as a question. I could not. You are starving. Yes. He took her hand and led her to the castle's undercroft, to the catacombs where the truly ancient ones kept their secrets. There, in a chamber lit only by the phosphorescence of decay, they came upon what Nikolai had prepared, a sanctuary of offered sacrifices. Not human, never human, he had promised her. Deer taken humanely, their bodies preserved in ice and moonlight, enough to sustain her through the initial hunger without crossing the threshold into true damnation. You prepared this for me? Margot asked. I have spent 4 centuries learning how to love without destroying, Nikolai said. I wanted to teach you a different way than the way I was taught. She fed from the animals, and the hunger became manageable. It became a song instead of a scream. And when it was finished, Nikolai pulled her close, and they moved through the undercroft together, past the tombs of his other loves, preserved not as mausoleums, but as reminders. One had been a saint. One had been a warrior queen. One had been a boy who could not have been older than 16. One had been a man who looked so similar to Nikolai they might have been brothers. They are all here, Margot said, running her fingers over the carved names. In death. In memory, Nikolai corrected. As long as I remember them, they do not truly die. The curse of immortality is not that we live forever. It is that we remember everything, and forgetting would be a cruelty worse than any destruction. Margot understood then why he had danced with her at the ball. It was not love at first sight. It was recognition. He had been searching for someone who understood that being damned together was preferable to bearing damnation alone. They emerged from the catacombs as dawn approached, that terrible, relentless dawn that burned like vengeance. They found shelter in a room without windows, and Nikolai held her as the sun rose outside, as it performed its daily torture against immortal flesh. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, Margot whispered, and her voice carried the weight of 4 centuries of loneliness, learning to sing again. And the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The day passed in darkness, and when night came again, they rose like the dead, like the reborn, like lovers who had chosen eternity over the mercy of forgetting. Comment eternal if you'd trade your soul for love that heals. Episode 4. The Garden of Remnants. Some gardens grow with blood and tears. They are the most beautiful gardens of all, because beauty purchased with suffering tastes like redemption. The castle possessed a garden that Margot had not discovered until her transformation was complete. It existed in the courtyard's eastern wing, enclosed by walls of stone so old they had begun to forget their own architecture. Within its borders, nothing bloomed. Nothing died. Everything existed in a state of perpetual twilight. Roses that had been dried for centuries, arranged in urns carved from marble, their petals still holding the faint stain of color, as though time had not been permitted to fully claim them. Nikolai took her there on the 10th night of her immortality, carrying a single white flower that seemed to burn against the darkness. What is this? Margot asked, reaching for it. Oleander, he said, the flower of resurrection, and also of death. Its beauty is toxic. It poisons the hand that touches it. For centuries, I have been unable to decide if that makes it the perfect symbol or the cruelest one. He placed it in her palm, and Margot felt no burn, no corruption. Only the smooth skin of the petal, fragile and absolute. Why did you bring me here? She asked. Because I want to show you something, Nikolai said, and there was a tremor in his voice that seemed to move through the garden itself. I want to show you what immortality truly means. He moved deeper into the garden, and she followed, past the roses, past stone benches arranged as though ghosts still sat upon them, to a wall that seemed ordinary until she looked closer and realized that names were carved into it. Hundreds of names. Thousands, perhaps. These are not people I loved, Nikolai said quietly. These are people I killed when I was young and did not know that love and hunger were not the same thing. This wall is my confession. It is my penance carved into stone. Every name here is a death that I carry in my chest, like a second heart. Margot moved along the wall, her fingers trailing over the carved letters. The names were in dozens of languages, spanning centuries. Some were ancient, some were recent. Some had been so carefully maintained that they seemed to glow in the moonlight. "How many?" she asked. 4,317, Nikolai said without hesitation. He had counted, he had kept count, the way only someone carrying true guilt could. "I have spent the last 300 years trying to ensure the number does not increase. I have spent the last 100 years trying to create beauty that might somehow balance the scale. None of it will ever be enough." Margot turned to face him, and she saw not the dangerous king who had asked her to dance, but a man who was drowning in the weight of his own eternity. "Then we balance it together," she said. "You do not carry this alone anymore. I cannot ask that of you." "You are not asking," Margot said. "I am choosing." She placed her hand on one of the blank spaces in the wall, where new names would eventually be carved. She understood now that immortality was not a gift. It was a responsibility. Every moment of life continued was a choice to not become what he had been, to not succumb to the hunger that would devour them both if they let it. They spent the night in the garden, and Nikolai told her stories of each death, not to glorify them, but to honor them, to ensure they were not erased into the abstraction of numbers. He spoke of a baker in Prague, a dancer in Vienna, a scholar in Istanbul. Each one had been a moment of weakness that had cost someone their eternity. "Can you forgive me?" Nikolai asked when the sun began to threaten the horizon. "For what?" Margot replied. "For being young, for being hungry, for trying to survive the unsurvivable? That is not forgiveness, Nikolai. That is understanding." She bent and kissed him, and her lips tasted of steel and starlight, and the profound acceptance that comes from knowing your lover's darkness and choosing to remain in it. The white oleander fell from her hand and landed on the stone, and for a moment it seemed to glow, neither alive nor dead, but existing in the space between, where all true beauty dwells. Follow for more immortal confessions born from blood and mercy. Episode 5. The Mortal Returns. Every love story contains a ghost. Sometimes the ghost is the past. Sometimes the ghost is the future, arriving early, demanding to be acknowledged. The castle's boundaries began to blur on the 15th night of Margot's transformation. A carriage arrived during the hours when mortals should have been sleeping, drawn by horses that moved as though they were not entirely convinced of their own existence. Within the carriage was a woman. She was old, not in the way of age, but in the way of accumulation. She had collected decades on her skin like moss on ancient stone. Her eyes were Margot's eyes. Her mouth was Margot's mouth. She was Margot's grandmother, and she had come to the castle with a knowledge that should have been impossible. "My grandchild," the old woman said, and her voice was a key that opened doors in time itself. "I have come to tell you what you must know." Nikolai attempted to turn her away, but Margot stopped him. There was something in the old woman's face that demanded to be heard. They sat in the library, the place where Margot's transformation had truly begun, and the grandmother told her story. "Your family," she said, "is cursed, not by the supernatural, but by the ordinary cruelties that humans devise. We were wealthy once. We were happy once. And then your great-grandfather fell in love with someone he was not supposed to love. A woman from a family of what your ancestors called the changed ones. Not vampires, but something close, something forgotten." Margot felt Nikolai tense beside her. "Your great-grandmother tried to give your great-grandfather an ordinary life," the old woman continued. "She drank blessed water and prayed in daylight and tried to become human. but the curse was already in the blood, and it passed down through generations. Your mother was born with the hunger. She suppressed it her entire life. She taught herself not to feed, not to transform, not to acknowledge what she was. And when she had you, she hoped the curse would skip a generation. It did not. "Why are you telling me this?" Margot asked. "Because," her grandmother said, "I am dying. And I wanted you to know that you are not damned because of Nikolai. You were damned the moment your bloodline diverged from human. He simply showed you how to stop fighting it." The old woman produced a small wooden box from the folds of her dress. Inside was a photograph, faded, monochrome, impossibly old. It showed a young man and a young woman standing in a garden not unlike the one in Ravencross's courtyard. The man's face was too beautiful to be entirely human. The woman's eyes held a hunger that no mortal eyes should possess. "This is your great-grandmother and the man she tried to love," the grandmother said. "He was like Nikolai, old, lonely, desperate for someone who could understand the weight of eternity. They loved for 70 years, and when she finally refused the transformation, when she chose to remain human and age and die, he wept. Not because she was leaving him, but because she was choosing the mercy of death over the burden of his love." Nikolai moved to the window, his entire body rigid with the weight of recognition. "What happened to him?" Margot asked quietly. "He went back to sleep," the grandmother said. "He wrapped himself in darkness and did not wake for another century. And now, I suspect, he has woken again, and he has found you, and he is hoping that this time the woman he loves will choose differently." After her grandmother left, returning to her carriage and her mortal life, her body already beginning to shut down from the effort of traversing the boundaries between worlds, Margot found Nikolai standing in the Garden of Remnants. "Did you know," she asked, "that we were connected?" "No," Nikolai said. "I recognized a kindred spirit. I thought it was chance. Now I wonder if chance exists at all, or if it is simply fate that we are too small to see the architecture of." "Do you regret it?" Margot asked. "Loving someone with my curse already inside her?" Nikolai turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes the weight of centuries lifting, just slightly. "I regret every death I caused when I was young and starving," he said. "I do not regret you. I could not regret you. You are the first person I have ever loved who understood that loving an immortal means accepting that immortality is not a reward. It is a weight that makes us grateful for every moment someone chooses to remain in the darkness with us." He took her hand, and together they walked back to the castle, leaving the Garden of Remnants behind. Above them, the stars seemed to burn brighter, as though the universe itself was acknowledging that some loves transcend the boundaries between worlds, between mortality and eternity, between damnation and redemption. Like if you'd choose eternity for love that sees your soul. Episode 6. The Reckoning. Every love contains the seeds of its own destruction. We are not asked to prevent the destruction, only to decide if we will remain present while it blooms. The hunters came on the 19th night. They were not the bumbling mortals that populated folklore. They were organized, methodical, armed with knowledge that should have been forgotten centuries ago. They knew about the castle, they knew about Nikolai, and they knew, somehow, about Margot. "The half-blood," their leader said, as she stood before them in the castle's great hall, her voice dripping with the certainty of those who believe they are performing a divine function. "The one born with the curse already in her veins. If she is not destroyed, the line will continue. The contamination will spread." Margot could have been afraid. Instead, she felt a strange clarity settle over her, like ice forming over still water. She understood now what her transformation had truly meant. It was not an escape from her stepmother's cruelty. It was an acceptance of a different kind of cruelty, the cruelty of a world that would never allow her to simply exist. Nikolai moved to shield her, but Margot stepped forward instead. "You fear me," she said to the hunters, "because I represent a truth you cannot contain. That the boundary between human and monster is not as clear as you need it to be. That curse and blessing are not opposites. They are the same phenomenon viewed from different angles." One of the hunters fired a silver bullet. It struck her in the shoulder, and pain, white-hot, immediate, instructive, bloomed through her body. She did not scream. She did not run. Instead, she pulled the bullet from her flesh and held it up to the candlelight. The silver burned her hand, but she did not release it. "This is what you believe will save you," Margot said. "Old remedies for a problem you do not truly understand. You hunt what you fear, and you fear what you cannot control. But I am not here to be controlled. I am here to choose." She turned to Nikolai, and their eyes met in a moment of profound understanding. What happened next would determine not only their future, but the fate of everyone in the castle. "Take me," Margot said. "Completely. I want to stop being half-blood. I want to be entirely what I am becoming." "That will kill you," Nikolai whispered. "The transformation." "I know. You will not be the woman you were." "No," Margot agreed. "I will be something more." The hunters attempted to move forward, but Nikolai simply raised his hand, and they found themselves unable to advance, held in place by a power so ancient it predated language. He pulled Margot close, and the kiss he gave her tasted like starlight and sorrow and the mercy of endings that contain new beginnings. His fangs descended, not to drain her, but to transform her. He bit into his own wrist and brought it to her mouth, and she drank. The blood that entered her was not warm. It was liquid eternity, measured in heartbeats older than centuries. It moved through her veins like a second skeleton, restructuring her from the inside out. She felt her humanity falling away like a coat she no longer needed, and in its place, something emerged, something ancient and terrible and absolutely free. When it ended, Margot was no longer half-blood. She was fully immortal. Her eyes had become entirely silver. Her skin possessed a luminescence that seemed to generate light rather than reflect it. She was beautiful in a way that transcended beauty, in the way that destruction is beautiful when it is necessary, when it clears space for something new. The hunters fled. They had come prepared for a vampire king and a confused young woman caught between worlds. They had not come prepared for a creature that had transcended both categories, that existed in a space between mortal and immortal, predator and prey, damnation and redemption. When they were gone, Margot stood in the great hall of Ravencross Castle, and she felt the entire weight of eternity settle onto her shoulders like a cloak. "It is done," Nikolai said quietly. "It has only just begun," Margot corrected. Together, they ascended to the castle's highest tower and looked out over the lands surrounding Ravencross. She could see everything now, the flow of blood in distant villages, the pulse of life in forests and streams, the intricate architecture of an entire world viewed from the perspective of the eternal. She could also see Nikolai's reflection in the window beside her own. And in that moment, she understood what he had always known, that love between immortals was not a story with an ending, but a story that continued to unfold across centuries, across transformations, across all the accumulated weight of being alive when the universe is dying around you. "If this story has already captured you," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to move through the tower itself, "leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Comment if you'd survive the night for someone worth dying for." Episode 7. The Garden Blooms. Redemption is not a place we arrive at. It is a direction we move toward for all eternity, and the moving is enough. 50 years passed as a single season in the consciousness of the immortal. The world changed. Empires rose and fell. Revolutions ate their children. Technologies emerged that would have seemed like magic to anyone living in the 19th century. Through it all, Ravencross Castle remained, a constant point in a variable universe. Margot had learned to hunt without killing, had learned to sustain herself on the animals of the forest and the blood that willing mortals offered in exchange for the mercy of her teeth. She had learned to read books in languages she had not even known existed when she was human. She had learned that immortality was not a curse, but a responsibility. The responsibility to witness, to remember, to ensure that the dead were not erased into irrelevance. And she had learned to love Nikolai in ways that transcended physical tenderness. They had stopped aging. They had stopped changing. And in that stasis, they had discovered something that few immortals ever found. Not happiness, which is a word too small for what they possessed, but contentment. The knowledge that the person beside you would remain beside you through infinite iterations of night and day, that your love had already survived enough centuries to convince you of its reality. The Garden of Remnants had begun to change. The oleander blooms, which should have withered centuries ago, had not only survived, but multiplied. Where once there had been only desiccated roses, there were now living flowers. The wall carved with names had been completed decades ago, but new sections had been added, not with names of the dead, but with quotes, poems, fragments of beauty extracted from the lives Nikolai and Margot had learned to treasure. On the 50th anniversary of Margot's transformation, they walked through that garden together, and Nikolai stopped before a section of newly carved stone. "These are for the living," he said, "for the people we chose not to hunt, for the moments we chose mercy instead of hunger. I wanted to commemorate them too." Margot ran her fingers over the carved words, poetry, fragments of songs, the names of ordinary people who had intersected with their lives and had received unexpected grace. "I have been thinking about something," Margot said, "about what comes next." "There is no next," Nikolai replied gently. "There is only the eternal now, recurring forever." "That is precisely what I mean," Margot said. "We have been living in the darkness of this castle for 50 years. We have been hiding. But I have realized something. I no longer need to hide. I was transformed because I was tired of being invisible. I cannot return to invisibility now, even in the form of a castle and a garden and a wall of stone." Nikolai understood what she was asking. "You want to walk in the world." "I want to exist in it," Margot said, "not as a monster, not as a curse, but as what I am. A being who has transcended the boundary between human and inhuman, and who has chosen to use that transcendence to create beauty instead of destruction." "The hunters." "The hunters are an invention of fear," Margot said, "and fear is only powerful when it remains unnamed. I think it is time to name it. Time to show the world that immortality is not something to be hunted or hidden, but something to be understood." That night, Nikolai and Margot left Ravencross Castle for the first time in 50 years. They walked through forests that had grown up around the boundaries of the property, and they found that the world was not nearly as hostile as they had feared. Mortals did not recognize them as monsters. They saw them as simply another couple. Beautiful, yes, but not fundamentally other. Over the following years, they moved through the world, and slowly, something unexpected happened. They became legends. Not the crude folklore of vampires and demons, but something more nuanced. Stories of two people who had chosen to remain together across impossible timescales, who had transcended the need to consume to survive, who had built a life around mercy rather than hunger. Some people sought them out. Others fled from them. But gradually, the understanding began to shift. What had seemed like a curse, immortality, hunger, the need to exist outside of normal human society, began to be recognized as what it truly was, a different form of existence, no more evil than being human, only more complex. And in the cities and small towns they visited, In the gardens they tended and the people they befriended, new flowers began to bloom. Oleander flowers, the flowers of resurrection and death, of poison and healing, of beauty that contained danger. Margot understood that they were not curing the world of its fear, but they were teaching it how to live with it, how to coexist with the unknown, how to accept that the boundary between light and shadow was not a wall, but a doorway through which love could pass. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Episode 8, Eternal Testament. The only immortality that matters is the immortality of choice. We are eternal not because we cannot die, but because every moment we remain alive, we choose to remain. Every sunset we witness is a resurrection. 200 years had passed since the night of the ball. The castle still stood, though it was no longer home. It had become a museum, a monument to the possibilities of redemption. Visitors came to walk through its halls, to see the Garden of Remnants, to read the names carved into the wall. Some recognized the truth beneath the historical narrative, that this was a place where immortals had chosen to live, as though mortality meant something. Nikolai and Margot did not live in the castle anymore. They moved through the world like echoes, like benedictions. They appeared sometimes to help, to guide, to offer mercy to those who had been marked by darkness. They had learned to exist without leaving traces. They had learned to love without consuming. But on one particular night, a night that corresponded to no calendar the mortals kept, but which the immortals remembered with absolute precision, they returned to Ravencross one final time. They stood in the garden at midnight, beneath stars that seemed to contain entire universes of light compressed into points that could barely contain their brilliance. "I have been thinking," Margot said, "about what death means for us." Nikolai did not respond immediately. The question had haunted him for centuries, the knowledge that immortality was ultimately a choice, that he could lay down the burden of eternal life at any moment if he wished. "Mortality taught me that death is the price we pay for having lived," Nikolai said finally. "Immortality has taught me that life is the price we pay for not dying. The question is not whether death comes for us, it is whether we are still choosing to live when it does." "And have you," Margot asked, "been choosing?" "Every moment," he said, "especially the moments when I wanted to stop." They sat together on a bench carved from marble centuries ago, and they watched the oleander flowers bloom in the darkness. The flowers that should have withered had instead learned to thrive, to generate their own light, to sustain themselves through a mechanism that transcended the normal laws of nature. "I want to leave a record," Margot said. "Not of our names or our deeds, but of our understanding. I want future immortals, because there will be others, to know that they do not have to be monsters. That love is not a trap, but a redemption. That choosing to remain alive, even when it is difficult, even when the hunger pulls at you, even when the centuries seem to stretch out endlessly, that choice matters. That choice makes you human, or more than human, or something that transcends the category altogether." "Then that is what we will leave," Nikolai said. They spent that night carving a final section into the wall of the garden. Not names this time, but a testament. Words in languages they had learned across 2 centuries of living. Phrases that contained the essence of what they had discovered. That love between broken things was the only redemption that had ever existed. That eternal life was only tolerable if it was lived in the presence of someone who understood the weight of it. That monsters who chose mercy were more human than humans who chose cruelty. When dawn threatened the horizon, they did not flee to darkness as they once would have. Instead, they walked directly into the light. The sun did not burn them as it once would have. They had transcended the basic vulnerabilities of their kind through centuries of choosing not to hunt, not to consume, not to surrender to the hunger. Their bodies had transformed to reflect their choices. They were no longer creatures of darkness, but creatures of transition, equally at home in shadow and light. "This is what immortality truly is," Margot said as the sun rose over Ravencross Castle, painting it in gold and amber. "Not endless life, but endless choice. The ability to decide every single day whether to remain in love with someone, whether to maintain mercy, whether to continue choosing light even when darkness would be easier." They stood in the courtyard as the sun rose fully, and slowly, so gradually that it was almost imperceptible, they began to fade. Not from death, but from transition. They were stepping sideways out of the world, moving into a space that could not be photographed, or documented, or understood by conventional means. "Tell them," Margot whispered as she faded, "that we are not gone. That we are in every act of mercy, in every moment someone chooses to remain alive for love, in every garden where impossible flowers bloom. That eternity is not something that happens to us. It is something we create through the choices we make." And then they were gone. The castle remained. The garden remained. The wall of names and testimony remained. And mortals who came to visit found that something had changed. The oleander flowers bloomed brighter than before. The testament carved into the wall seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the world felt too heavy to bear, people reported seeing two figures walking through the garden, a man and a woman. Each bearing a scar that matched the other, each bearing the weight of centuries as though it were a privilege rather than a burden. In the cities and villages of the world, wherever an immortal walked in shadows, they knew the story. The scarred girl and the vampire king. The ones who had chosen to become something more than monsters. The ones who had proven that eternity was not a curse, but an opportunity, an infinite span of time in which to practice love, to perfect mercy, to demonstrate that redemption was not a destination, but a direction. Every sunset in Ravencross Castle witnessed an oleander bloom. Every midnight brought new names to the wall, written by hands no one had seen, testifying to new acts of immortal compassion. And the world, slowly, learned to stop hunting what it did not understand, and began instead to welcome the possibility that monsters, true monsters, might choose not to be monstrous, might choose instead to remain in the darkness with those who loved them, might choose to believe that mercy could resurrect even the damned. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance. Follow for more immortal confessions born from blood and mercy. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned.